Right, now I've got to follow the fire safety announcement. Right, morning everyone, my name's Chris. I'd like to talk very fast about cameras because I've got quite a lot of slides to cover. A little bit about me. I've worked in the industry for about 20 years. The last 15 years of that was at TT Games, and for the last 4 or 5 years of that I worked on their camera systems, making tools for the artists to use to set stuff up. Really interested in cameras, cinematography. I also make short films and videos in my spare time when I have spare time. And so I've recently started Quantum Super Studios to kind of like converge those two interests of games and films and do some filmy games of my own. So that's where I'm coming from. And I want to cover a bit of linear cinematography first, because we've had a century or so of development in that field, and a lot of the rules of cinematography are very applicable to games. So I want to cover some of the stuff that is hopefully, some of it is not all that obvious to people in the games sphere. So first films, obviously things like a train pulling into a station, was just putting a camera somewhere, filming some stuff happening. And it took a few years for people to come up with the first cut. That film is called, I've forgotten the name of it, damn it. It's the first film with a cut from outside a museum to inside a museum. And then a few years later than that, the first close-up. This top shot was the punchline to a film in which a girl holds off bank robbers using what looks like a gun, and it's revealed at the end that it was a wrench instead. So the first close-up was for purely practical terms. The gag did not work if you couldn't see that object clearly. Then the year after that, we have the first close-up for emotional reasons. This was the climax of a film in which this girl is trying to decide between two men, and she basically ends up with the one that turns out she doesn't fancy much. Which you couldn't tell unless you could see her face clearly. So that was an interesting development. And then a few years later than that, we progressed to the point where we're getting amazing photography like this, which shows incredibly powerful emotion. This is from The Passion of Joan of Arc. And the entire film, they built an entire village for this film and then shot the entire film almost entirely in close-ups. The backers were most unhappy that their expensive village did not really show up very much, but it was a good film. So framing, everybody's familiar with your basic set of different shots for framing different distances, different amounts of stuff, but you can also use framing to convey more emotional things. So, for example, David Lean famously, with Lawrence of Arabia, used a lot of very wide frames, making characters look very tiny on screen to indicate how insignificant they are in the vastness of the desert. In The Matrix, we have cameras. We have not just the camera, obviously the set design is all very squared off and angular and rigid, but the cameras are placed very square to the surroundings to give a sense of artificiality to the Matrix environments. You can also use it for to convey emotional things. In this shot from Catch Me If You Can, Tom Hanks is squeezed into the corner of the frame in the same way that his character is cornered in the plot. And obviously, famous shot from the Graduate. So the framing things on screen can very easily visually convey stuff that is going on in the storyline. Focus, super useful. This is actually a shot from one of my shorts, and which is again interestingly framed because the focus is on her ear because she's listening to the girl in the background. I didn't put a video of this in, but it's about a focus pull to the girl in the background talking, so you can see what she's hearing. But that focus pulling is a great way of drawing attention, or just sort of focusing on things because it forces you to, for example, in this case from the King's Speech, the microphone is you can't really focus. It's really obvious there. It's huge. It's filling the screen, but the focus on the actors forces you to pretty much ignore the microphone, because you can't see any detail of the microphone. All you can do is to get the impression of a microphone, but the detail is all on the actors. It forces the audience to focus on the thing that the director wants them to see. Lens is a fascinating thing, which we're starting to be able to play around with in games too. The distance that you put the camera from the actors and the this is kind of like representing the field of view. Obviously, modern games can do things like barrel distortion as well to get a really like curvy fisheye effect. But it totally changes the way that you look at an actor or a subject, which Terry Gilliam is very fond of using to create a kind of skewed, weird view of the world. The flip side of that is if you use a very long lens, then you end up with a very compressed image, which it flattens all of the depth of it and focuses everything together. So, let's see. It also works with wide shots. Here we've got a wide lens which brings in a lot of the town background and creates a bit of separation between the foreground characters and background characters, even though they're in a group. And then with a long lens, the background is squeezed out, and we've brought all of those characters closer together. So camera position, also really important. So in this shot we've got a wizard looking weak and a child looking powerful, even though they're both pointing weapons into the camera. Because putting the camera up above makes people look comparatively weak, putting it below makes them tower over you. Movement is a fascinating thing as well. The Matrix obviously famously did the bullet time sequences, which was a great way of stretching out a significant story moment into something that the audience could really take their time to appreciate and take in the importance of that scene. Peter Jackson did. This is a fascinating shot because I think it might be the first Vertigo shot. Hitchcock used it obviously in Vertigo, which is where it gets its name. But the Vertigo pull here, I think, might be the first one on an empty frame, which creates an amazing effect of distorting the space and foreshadowing the arrival of the Nazgul on that path. And this is an interesting one because David, this is something that I've nicked from the Nerd Writer on YouTube. You should have a look at his stuff. It's very good. David Fincher basically has a particularly good camera technique. He has the camera follow the actor's movements really, really tightly. All of this has to be incredibly well rehearsed, but the effect that it creates is that it puts the audience in sync with that character. So, and also it isolates that character. So even when you've got a group of people on screen, you can tell who you're supposed to be focusing on because the camera is following their movement with even the most subtle little adjustments. So that movement was barely worth moving the camera for, but moving the camera with Daniel Craig there keeps the audience engaged with the character. Visual juxtaposition, again, David Lean combining the massive mountains with a tiny, tiny column of people to create that visual contrast is a fascinating tool. And then temporal juxtaposition or cut is famous. This is probably the most one of the most significant cuts where the ape in 2001 has discovered that he can use a bone as a weapon, and he smashes up a skeleton. Again, we've got a wide shot making the ape look powerful with his new weapon, and bringing in sort of like the massive sky and the skeleton there. And then he throws it up in the air, and we cut to the spaceship across 4 million years, which creates that link between sort of like the primitive ape and the theoretically more advanced space travellers. So that very rapidly covers about 100 years of cinematic development. There's a lot more detail in there. There's all sorts of interesting stuff about crossing the line, about sort of like space for people to look into. If you frame people off to so that there's a lot of space behind their head, you create that expectation that they are going to be surprised. All sorts of interesting little tricks. But I'm going to move on to game-related stuff. The problem with games is that there isn't really a director who has full control of the camera. So games can do beautiful things if you take control of the camera and you just show the player stuff that they need to see. However, for practical purposes, if you're actually trying to play, what you want is something more like this. Now, that is an extremely practical top-down view. It shows you the spatial relationships between everything, and it's very clear. You can see what's going on, but it's not very interesting from a narrative perspective. So even something a bit more narrative like Divinity has to use these little portraits and things to try to highlight the characters. Because the game is built to work top-down, and it's optimised to work top-down, it means that all of the assets are also optimised to work top-down. So if you wanted to bring the camera in like this, you've got to be able to render off to the horizon, and you've got to have all of this detail in the hair, in the clothes, because the camera's got very close to it. And obviously, Divinity doesn't have that same level of detail in the characters, so they have portraits to replace that instead. But these are the constraints that you have to work within. But there's still plenty of potential for playing around with the camera, even in a situation like this. You can zoom in to a certain extent. You can zoom out. You can have camera shake and things like that. So. But again, even with The Witcher, where they've got a massive amount of resources, they can render off to the horizon and do. Compare this beautifully staged screenshot of a fight with what you're more likely to get in game. This is much more practical, but it's not very pretty. The key thing here is that you can't preserve a beautiful looking framed shot and allow the player to see everything that they need to see for gameplay at the same time, necessarily. In some cases you can, but most of the time those two things are a little bit at odds. So there's, in interactive terms, there's some interesting stuff to do with framing. Gears of War is an interesting example. Most first-person shooters just give the player full control of the camera and just sacrifice that control to the player in the name of empowering them. Gears of War, interestingly, put the camera behind the player. Obviously, Resident Evil had done it as well, but Gears of War did it particularly well. Your default view keeps the player reasonably small on screen, so they're not too obtrusive. But when you aim, you focus in, it pulls the player right in, so that you're really close to the character that you're controlling. And when you're doing something like a chainsaw duel, it will take control away from you and move the camera to somewhere more dramatic for that particular activity. Uncharted does a lot of fun things with the camera. There's, in this example, the normal camera position is pulled back to make Nathan look kind of small and show more of this vast ship, to create a sense of epic scale there. As you come out of caves, the camera attempts to kind of look down so that you can move down so that you can see the big vistas as you emerge from a claustrophobic space. And obviously, during the more scripted animation sequences, you've got some wonderful dramatic cameras which are part scripted, part dynamic, so that as you're being dragged along behind the truck, you can sort of steer left and right to a certain extent, but you've got a bit of freedom there. But it's, in practical terms, you could do that as a top-down shot. It would work, it would be perfectly functional, kind of look like Spy Hunter, but it wouldn't look anywhere near as dramatic from a narrative perspective. In terms of directing attention, games have tried a lot of different methods for this. Because of this kind of like dichotomy between directed camera and a practical camera, Journey has a couple of places where it will pull the camera back to show you a good like overview of the level, the area that you're about to enter. But what they do is they leave you in control of the character. That works for Journey because there's no combat. You're unlikely to, you can't really die. So nothing bad is likely to happen by leaving the player running around, even potentially off screen. You can get while the camera pulls back out, and then it blends back in, and everything resumes. Gears of War, on the other hand, gives you a Y button prompt to acknowledge that you are happy to allow the game to show you something. And if you don't press the Y button, then you just, because you're busy shooting somebody, then you can miss what the game was trying to show you, but you had the choice to do that. And then games like BioShock, which have surrendered completely control of the camera, they have to use environmental cues and so on to draw the eye and frame things instead. So a few examples from games that I think are particularly interesting. This one is a bit of a cheat because Life is Strange is so beautifully directed. It's not so, it doesn't have a lot of the issues of practicality for combat and so on. But I particularly like this shot because it frames the two protagonists with like the railway tracks going into the distance imply a journey. The fact that they're both sort of balancing along the tracks makes them look a bit uncertain. Their hands are almost touching but not quite. This is in a scene where they're trying to sort of reconnect after many years apart. Chloe gets her foot stuck and you save her from a train. Spoilers. And then this shot is mirrored after that by this shot. Again, same train tracks, same sort of like sense of going on a journey, only now they are together. And I think that's a beautiful bit of purely visual storytelling. Batman Arkham City has a particularly neat trick using Dutch tilt, or what is called a Batman angle because of its overuse in the 60s Batman TV show. There's a chapter in which Batman gets poisoned, and over the course of that chapter, the camera tilts more and more as Batman becomes increasingly sick. You still have control of the camera, but it's just tilted. It's extremely unnerving, and it creates a really good sense of being unsettled and a little bit. It slightly inhibits your ability to play, but not significantly. Journey, obviously, if you're not familiar with Journey, then you should leave now and go and play it because it's just wonderful. But there's a particular moment in Journey that is very obviously. Journey's got full of all sorts of interesting stuff to do with the sound, the colour, the palette, and everything. But there's a lovely moment here where you are at the end of the long high-speed run. We come to this end, and then the camera cuts to a still sense where the player is helpless and tiny in frame, and we see your goal of the mountain being snatched away from you as you descend into the stillness of the underworld. That's a beautiful way to conclude that high-tempo slalom down the slides. And then my favourite example, which I'm going to rattle through now, is from Tomb Raider. The 2014 reboot of Tomb Raider has some fantastic camera work and lots of other nice things to recommend it. But this was my favourite sequence, which is almost entirely camera-based. This is the standard dramatic camera for going across a rope. Then we get onto the platform, and you start climbing the tower. So we get a little intro cutscene to show what she's doing. Then we're back to the standard camera. You're in control. You have to push her up. Notice that the camera shake is in time with her animations, like David Fincher's moves. So you're engaged with the character here. And you're working your way up, and then they start adding interest by having a little jump scare there. We've got a focus pull following the broken bit into the depths, and while the player recovers from the jump scare, we've got a little cutscene where she gets onto the platform, so you're out of control. Again, camera moves with Lara, like David Fincher's does, and we're showing a bit more of the stuff. Now, you're back in control, back to the default camera angle. It's up to you to push her up the ladder again. This time they put the jump scare at the beginning. Now they've cut to show the threat behind her. They could have blurred that out, but they've left it there so that you can see the level that you've been through. At this point, you can now see that you're up above the mountains. They've obviously the animation conveys her fear, but then the camera moves up and shows the vertiginous scale of this thing. Pans around, and we're back to the default angle again. Now, even though she goes off screen, you're going up. Now you can see the goal. You've got hero's angle on Lara. She's going for that goal, but you can see that there's this challenge ahead. As she approaches this final challenge, the camera moves above to show the threat behind her and make her look a bit uncertain and weak. And so you jump for that. Yeah, it's good, isn't it? And now she's made it past that bit, and now she has moved into the relative safety of this little nest, and we get a lovely dramatic hero shot panning around her, and go into a cutscene. And if I remember correctly, after the cutscene, you have a magical rope that you can slide down to save you climbing back down again. But so. After those examples, the key things that I've drawn from working through this and from doing a lot of work with cameras, key things to do with cameras is that you have to accept that you are sometimes going to need to have a very practical camera view that works for gameplay, and then sometimes you're going to need to have something that works better for story. So you're going to need to embrace going backwards and forwards between the two if you're doing a reasonably cinematic game. But you should also not be afraid to constrain what the player is able to do to fit the story that you're trying to tell. So, for example, with the Tomb Raider example, once you get onto that ladder, you can move up and down. Pretty much all of Lara's other abilities are just disabled. You can climb back down the ladder, and I think you can get off at the bottom, but nothing happens unless you get back on the ladder and progress upwards. So, and taking control away from the player to tell a little bit of story is okay. It works. And there are a lot of tools. So even if you've got a top-down view, even with something like Diablo, if you want to, or Divinity, if you want that top-down view, you can zoom in and out. You can pan left and right. You can show more ahead of the character than just all around the character. You can do camera shakes, you can do Dutch tilt, depending on the sort of game that you're doing. Even with 2D games, most of these things work. So there are and then there's also the other framing techniques with putting the player at the bottom of the screen if they are approaching something like big and impressive, like a boss, for example. There's a lot of tricks that you can do even in 2D or with gameplay, even if that your camera is locked to side on. So, I ran through that so fast that I've got loads of time for questions. Does anybody have any questions? No? Let's go get coffee. Oh, yes.
Hi. I'm just wondering, like, in games, what do you do about, like, color cameras? I mean,
color?
Film has its grading tools, and it
yes.
can, like, grade on a film, like, when you do the digital media. What about for games? Do you think about any sort of systems like that to, like, somebody would create a creative grade for the whole game and just kind of like...
Yeah, I mean, I would it's another one of the tools. I mean, I've been very much focused in this talk on the just the camera itself and the framing. But yeah, absolutely. Grading is really important. It's really easy to do as well. It's certainly in Unity and Unreal. You've got all of the tools you need for that provided, and there's stuff on the asset store as well that will sort of like help you if you're not familiar with messing around with grading. But yeah, you can do all sorts of interesting things with dynamic exposure and playing around with tinting and so on. There's just thinking if I've got some examples. There's some, actually, yeah. There's so that like that. That's a very bluish tint there. That's fairly flat. Journey obviously has got a very yellow, golden sort of kind of glow to it. Yeah, there's some interesting stuff with post effects because a lot of post effects are designed to mimic film. So you have things like lens flare and bloom and lens dirt, barrel distortion. All of these things have been put into games specifically in order to make games look like film, because that's what we're used to seeing in the cinema, and it looks expensive and it looks dramatic. So yeah, you can play around with all of those things quite easily in game engines. And yeah, there's a whole load of stuff I could talk about that. Okay. Alexis.
Hello. So, great talk. That question dovetails very neatly into mine, which is, obviously there isn't a physical camera at all in this, and obviously you can do things without a physical camera like that sequence with Lara at the end, which is completely impractical. Are there other techniques that you've seen used in games that would be completely impractical with a camera besides not having to attach a physical camera to anything moving around? There are other things which are game native or digital native in that way.
That's an interesting one. In Hollywood they have a temptation to try to do clever things with the camera that look really difficult. So, for example, like Pulp Fiction's got a lot of Steadicam moves where like the camera will follow Bruce Willis sort of like down the side of a house and like through a hole in the fence completely smoothly, and just by having like the Steadicam operator basically climbing through the hole in the fence, and the Steadicam rig smooths it all out. And then there's like famous long uncut shots in Hollywood are really sort of considered really cool and dramatic, because there's a sense that the audience understands how difficult they are to pull off, and so on. I think the trouble is that it starts to fall apart when you've got a film like The Hobbit, where you have like the camera flying through the goblin caves. The fact that was at 48 frames per second didn't help as well. It made it look like a video game because it just looked impossible for a camera to do. To be fair, they did do some sort of like camera flying shots at the end of Fellowship of the Ring, which was a camera on a set of wires flying through the forest, and so they actually did that. But yeah, in games you can put the camera anywhere and you can do long uncut shots considerably more easily because it's all sort of like simulated and carefully put together. But if you try to simulate real camera moves, then it does create a sense of verisimilitude. So, for example, in my game, I'm putting a bit of sort of continuous gentle camera shake on pretty much everything to make it look like it's being filmed by somebody, and give it a slightly sort of like rougher documentary look. Things like that, and for cutscenes at TT Games, the cutscene artists had rigs for cranes and dollies, so that they could basically set up the camera to move in ways that a real camera would, because it gives you a slightly more filmic look than just flying the camera in impossible ways. But yeah, I mean, even David Fincher has done a lot of impossible camera moves, like with Fight Club, where you've got like a camera flying into the sort of like the cooker hob in his apartment just before he explodes. that was completely impossible. It was all done with photogrammetry and then CG, but it looked cool because people hadn't seen it before, and they went, how was that done? Obviously, nowadays everybody would just assume it's CG, and it wouldn't consider it quite so impressive. But yeah, it works both ways. Yeah, Hollywood tried to do impossible moves, and it can make it look a bit. It can make it look clever, or it can make it look fake. And likewise with games, you can do things that are impossible for a normal camera quite easily, but it actually looks more convincing if you do something that is possible. Sorry, that was a bit ranty. So you had a question before it.
In VR or in 360
yeah.
movies, people are trying to use cinematography, but most of things are usually in first person. But you can always put somewhere a camera and make a scene.
Yeah.
What do you think about this VR experience?
Yeah. I think VR. Hollywood is very keen on doing 360 video, which I think is a pointless dead end because it's not proper VR. The power of VR is the interactivity, is the fact that you can enter that space and you can not just move around, but VR really comes to life once you've got the hand controllers and you can just pick stuff up and move it around and do things. 360 video doesn't have that. It doesn't even have proper parallax when you move your head. And you can't interact with it at all, except maybe at branch points if you filmed a lot of stuff. So I kind of see that as a bit of a dead end for 360 video. For VR in general, I think if you come back for Ian's talk later, he's got some suggestions about things like much more detail about directing attention when you don't have control of the camera, which is kind of. Yeah, it's tricky. It's much more Bioshock style stuff where the player has control and you just have to set up stuff that draws the player's eye and try to sort of prime them psychologically to look at certain things or guess what they're trying to do.
It's got to be the last question.
One more question. Comes.
What would you consider doing for long dialogue scenes where there's not a lot of movement or very much going on, just to keep it interesting?
To keep it interesting, yeah, that's a really good point. It depends on the content of the scene. Basically, if you've got a long dialogue scene, hopefully there is some sort of emotional backwards and forwards going on between the characters. If it's all exposition, then maybe you want to try and get that information in some other way rather than having characters recite it. If there's some emotional backwards and forwards, then you can use the camera to highlight that. So, ideally, every line of a scene is a tiny little turning point where one character is either sort of like taking the upper hand from the other, or wrong-footing the other character, or revealing something. Revealing some secret to the other character. So you can use all of those techniques for making characters look like they are powerful or weak or cornered and so on, depending on the content of the scene. But yeah, it does mean that you really want the every scene to be very very directed. But you can automate that to a certain extent. I've got. For my scene, I'm tagging each line of dialogue with like a camera angle, so that I can very very quickly basically like direct a scene just by sort of tagging this as being like this is a close up, this is a wide shot, and so on. Depending, that's mostly just for action. If they're performing a full body animation, I don't want a close up. But that's a quick way of directing it without having to animate the camera. Right. Thank you very much.